Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 24th Sunday after Pentecost, or All Saints Sunday, for the week of November 3rd, 2024, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig into this week's podcast, and I'm excited because, like last week, there is a lot of readings, but I will also argue this ties in really well to last week's podcast. So if you haven't listened to that one, I'd highly recommend it because I feel like we're going to kind of continue to build off of that. I really see Reformation, All Saints, and especially the supplementary texts, if you're not celebrating those, play into this narrative really well. And I think it's worth going through and spending a little time thinking about. And I don't think we do that enough. And this is a week that I think it can really get us some heavy-hitting topics. But in order for us to get there, we need to go through last week's question, which was, how can we think about things in generations instead of shorter time frames? And how can we look at the long haul instead of the short term? And I think this is a really difficult subject for our brains to think about because we're so used to just thinking about getting through the next day, getting through the next week, getting through the next month, getting through the next year. It's not typical for a person to sit there and say, I'm trying to think about my next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And throughout our society, throughout our culture, the people who are able to do that, even fiscally, are typically more successful. The people who are willing to think beyond where we're at because it's atypical are the ones who are able to make major change and really impact our world. And I think one of the responses that we brought back, it's really difficult for us to think about, do I need to run to town right now to pick up this item, or can I wait a day or two? And us being afraid of, I'll forget it. Or do I need to order something on Amazon right now, or can I wait and bundle it together so that there's less emissions? Can we think about things in designing things out to be easier for us to move around, easier for us to get place to place, less dependent on cars, at least here in America? Things of that nature take a lot more effort, take a lot more concentration, take a lot more effort in planning than we typically do. And so sometimes that's really difficult for us, and I think it's essential for us, but yet it's difficult in order for us to really get our heads around, and it will help us actually move forward if we're willing to do it. So let's just jump into it. I'm going to start with the All Saints text because technically that is November 1st. It might be celebrated sometime around here, but I think it's worth starting with that, and then we'll move into the 24th Sunday after Pentecost. So let's start with the All Saints text. The Old Testament text is from the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 3, verses 1 to 9. This is a text recognizing how when we are being righteous and following the Lord, there's going to be times that people are looking at us and like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? But yet, when we are looked at that way and seen as sometimes foolish, we end up winning in the end, that we are being refined. I like here in verses 5 and 6 where we get into being compared to being like gold in a furnace, where that's a way of getting out the impurities within a metal, that it's going to become this thing that is stronger but with less impurities, that we continue to trust even though there's times when it's going to be difficult for others to understand why we're doing that we are deepening our relationship with God, and it's getting us more to the will of who God is wanting us to be and to become truer to who God has made us to be. The other alternative Old Testament text then is from Isaiah chapter 25 verses 6 to 9. This is then recognizing that the Lord has this abundance designed for us, that there's things in this world that we will look at that cast darkness on this, but yet the Lord is willing to restore and is willing to go through that with his people, even though that we fall short of that. But we have to be willing and able to trust God and go through that with him, and thus being able to be invited to that celebration. The psalm that goes with these is Psalm 24, all 10 verses of it. This is then recognizing that we live in a world that God is in charge of, and is recognizing and giving praise to that, recognizing that we fall short of that, and recognizing that us acknowledging that is part of us being able to receive the blessing of what God is. It's keeping us humble in that way, recognizing that God is in charge, not us. God is in charge, and it's God who brings the glory to this place. It's not us. We reflect who God is. The New Testament text that goes with that is from Revelation chapter 1, verses 1 to 6a. And this is then getting into that text that John has for the returning of the Lord, the new earth, the new Jerusalem, this idea of how the earth is restored, the home of the Lord is restored, that the tears of the hardships will be wiped away, death will be no more. This restoring of the earth, that the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, comes back and makes the earth the place that God has desired this place to be. And the gospel text this week for All Saints Year B will be John chapter 11, verses 32 through 44. This is the raising of Lazarus. So Jesus is coming back into town. We hear that Mary is there and is crying and weeping that her brother has died. And Martha's even kind of bringing Jesus, what are we doing here? My brother has been dead for 4 days. Now, this is really important, especially within Jewish culture at this time, that the soul leaves the body after 3 days. So this is really important detail, especially for our ears to be able to understand in this phase, that Jesus comes in and then restores to health Lazarus, has Lazarus come out and calling into the tomb, and comes out in bands of cloth, that he has been restored to new life, that something has been dead, has been passed away, has now been restored and brought back. So if you're on the 24th Sunday after Pentecost, these are your texts this week. Let's jump into them. One of the Old Testament texts that you can have is from Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. This is a wonderful story, and I don't think we necessarily spend enough time talking about it. It's with Ruth and Naomi. So here we have Naomi, who is an elder woman, has 2 children, and her husband dies. And she tells both Ruth and Orpah, who has married her sons, to go and marry another person. There is better opportunities for you. Just leave me. I will be on my own. I will figure that out. Orpah ends up leaving, but Ruth clings to her and says, I am not leaving you. I am not abandoning you. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. I am going to be with you and love on you, and we're going to go through this together. I am not letting you be a widow by yourself. I will be there to take care of you. And so this idea of Ruth clinging on to Naomi and not letting her go and tackle this world on her own. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 146, all 10 verses of it. And this is a praise psalm. We get praise the Lord multiple times, and recognizing that our hope and our help come from God. That when we are going through the trials and tribulations of this life, that we continue to turn our face toward God, and recognizing that God will be that one who provides food, provides in the land, provides our eyes to be open, opening up our minds to different and new ideas, that the Lord is the one doing that, not on our own. The other Old Testament text this week is out of Deuteronomy chapter 6, the first 9 verses of it. This is coming a chapter after Moses has given the 10 commandments here. And so this is kind of that continuation of Moses speaking to the people, and is recognizing that as the people, part of following these commandments, these statutes, these ordinances that God is laying out is going to help in being able to establish a relationship with God, having us grow deeper, having that relationship grow, our love of the Lord grow deeper. And this relationship is vital to who we are as people, and is going to be a guidepost for us, allowing us to keep our eyes focused on where we need to be, as long as we continue to trust in the Lord and recognizing that the Lord is going to provide for us, flowing with lands of milk and honey, we get here from verse 3, as has been promised. We keep our ordinances, God fulfills God's promises as well. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 119, the first 8 verses of it. And this is then recognizing that as we then walk in the line of where God is calling us to be, as we are continuing to be in relationship and following the laws in which God has used for us, that then we are able to rejoice. We are able to be happy. We recognize that there is more things. The true joy of what God is providing for us is provided because we are keeping our eyes fixated, and we're allowing ourselves to be able to see the way that God sees more and more. The epistle text or second reading this week is out of Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11 to 14. This is then the recognition and kind of continuing on here in Hebrews that what Christ did washes us clean. So as we are pursuing what God is calling us to do, we have to recognize that there is times that we are going to fall short, but as long as we are continuing to pursue where God is calling us and recognizing that we are washed clean, that we no longer have to do these sacrifices, this is what Christ's blood was for, that we will fall short. But as long as we continue to turn that to God and continue to keep our eyes fixated on where God is calling us to be, we are washed clean, we are seen blameless in that. The gospel text that goes with this then is out of Mark chapter 12, verses 28 to 34. This is where one of the scribes then is hearing Jesus' talk and asking Jesus, which commandment is first of all? And Jesus responds in verse 29, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandments greater than these." And Jesus then continues on and talking about then, because of this love that we have for God and this love that we have for others, that then this is much more important than burnt offerings and sacrifices. And remember, he's talking to the scribes. This is a major part of their job. The scribes then are kind of taken back, and no one dared ask him another question other than saying, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." This recognition on what Jesus has stated is so true that there really wasn't a clear and easy rebuttal from the scribes, and having them reflect on what they had been doing and getting caught up in themselves. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plugs. Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between the Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, or commentaries, or discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, ways to be thinking about and contemplating these texts on a week-to-week basis. I find it a great resource to get some amazing biblical scholars going through and taking these resources and being able to provide them in a new and different way. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Pennsylvania Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also having liturgical art going out throughout time and history, along with prayers, hymns, liturgical colors, daily devotions. There is a lot of great resources over here that can really help stimulate and bring in some new reflecting ideas on how to look at these texts. Again, as you are preparing for worship week to week, as you are listening to this, I would recommend at least checking this stuff out, because I think it really helps us imagine and think about things in different ways. And how are other people looking at these texts through the art, through hymns, through prayers? I think this is a really important resource. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Pennsylvania Library, I'd highly recommend it. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter, which then also has the weekly reflections, that covers different ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies. Being able to take that into the weekly lectionary, kind of like what I do on a week-to-week basis, but along with some additional great resources on thinking about things a little bit more ecologically. So if you enjoy listening to me for a half an hour week after week, I'd highly recommend checking this stuff out, and that will be the first link in the show notes. Loving God and loving neighbor. I think these are things that are really difficult. And in the world in which we're at this weird crossroads, because we have to be thinking about things in ways that are extremely difficult, and means that some of us, including people like myself, are probably going to have to adjust our lifestyles whether we like it or not. And we've also gotten to this interesting point where the science and ethics of things are also running right up against each other, and it's going to make for some very interesting decisions that we need to make as a community, and it's not easy decisions. And that's a lot to be throwing at you to start this science part of this discussion, but I think it sets the table well, because we need to be talking about this and thinking about this and contemplating this. If you've listened to my podcast plenty of times before, you know that there is plenty of times where I've gotten very passionate about various different ecological things, and we are definitely getting to different tipping points within that, and we're not going to get into that this week. But what we are going to get into is from the decisions that we have made from our past, it is from forming some potential decisions that we're making in our future, and we need to contemplate and see if we can learn from these. So let's just jump into this. One of the things that's really hard for us to wrap our heads around is how ecosystems fully work. Because ecosystems, I like thinking of, are kind of like teeter-totters. You have to have balance in things. You can go up, you can go down, but there's an equilibrium to things, back and forth, back and forth. The issue is when we get more and more things, there's more and more variables, so now there's suddenly more things in that teeter-totter, and as long as, if you imagine like a round circle of teeter-totters that were all connected, as long as there is still a flow, it works. The issue is when you start removing things, it doesn't work as well. And we're starting to recognize this. There was something that came across Wisconsin Public Radio and News this last week that is very interesting, and it kind of brings into this discussion of ethics that I was talking about, is should we try resurrecting the passenger pigeon? And there's an article attached down below, great interview talking about it, and there's multiple reasons for this. One of the things that they were talking about is within forest life cycles, which we've talked about before, one of the things that is extremely vital to a forest ecosystem is the turnover. Having some type of fire or disruption that causes an ecosystem to kind of hit the reset button and turn over. Now, if you know anything about the passenger pigeon, it's believed that it was probably the most abundant bird even 250 years ago, probably on the planet. That there was recollections of how when they would migrate, they would pass by and the sky would darken because of how thick the flocks were. What that did is, especially in ecosystems like in the northern United States, like states like Wisconsin, you would have where these passenger pigeons would come in and actually cause destruction to the trees because they would be so dense, so much weight, and they would pass a lot of poop. Guano would be dropped, and what does that actually do? It suffocates the forest floor because there is so much guano, it would be inches thick, and thus allowing for actually new fertilizer for actually new things to grow. This was a major, what we're theorizing as a keystone species for these northern forest ecosystems. What we have run into is naturally these birds were extinct around 1902, and probably the last one dying in Indiana and Illinois. And the last one held in a zoo passed away on September 1st, 1914 in the Cincinnati Zoo. And similar to like the American bison, these have now kind of vacated much of their original habitat. What we are realizing is that there is potential that we can bring these things back. We can take a similar species and being able to bring it back. We can use some cloning mechanisms. So we can do somatic cell nuclear transfer, aka cloning, and then we can edit the stem cells of the bird, which is the primordial germ cells, the PGCs. And in doing that, putting that into a bird that is very similar to the passenger pigeon, and then we would be able to make, technically, a hybrid. Because technically, we really can't bring that bird back. We can bring back something that is similar. We can't make the exact same thing. And we have birds that are very similar to that, but is that the right thing to do? Technically, we have the genome, we have the DNA, we can do this. Is this the right thing to do? This is kind of continued in the Tasmanian tiger. There was a huge breakthrough in the last week and a half where we have been able to get RNA of a Tasmanian tiger. Now, why is that so important? We had the DNA. The RNA then helps us recognize which genes were turned on and which ones were off. So we recognize at a more distinct level what things were actually turned on, which traits were actually turned on, which traits were not turned on for different individuals within the Tasmanian tiger. So that we can run that, we can figure things out genetically for these Tasmanian tigers. We are extremely close to being able to bring them back. Should we? The problem is we recognize that, yes, genetically, that's a major part of who we are. But we also know as being humans and observing other species, environment is another major thing to creating us to who we are. The environments in which these animals were last around, the Tasmanian tiger passing away and becoming extinct in the 1930s, is much different. Are we ready for the differences of what they're going to bring while they're figuring out what their role is? And are they going to fill the same role that they did previously? That is a major question to discuss. But the question even becomes is, why are we even having this type of discussion? Why don't we just bring in something that's already living? Well, we've done that type of thing before. An example of this is a small Indian mongoose. We have brought these in multiple different places around the world, the Caribbean and Hawaii, to control rodent populations in particular, and maybe some snakes. And what has happened? They're extremely good at not only controlling that, but then also affecting, like in Hawaii, ground nesting birds and the eggs, and actually causing some extinction of other birds and having ramifications that we were not expecting. And thus now we have problems. Here's the problem, folks. Because this is the same thing that when we're talking about, do we bring back Tasmanian tigers? Do we bring back woolly mammoths to help be able to bring back the permafrost of the Arctic to help with climate change? Yes, they could. But at what ramification, what variables are we not considering that's going to impact that? Bringing back passenger pigeons, are we ready for that type of impact? Is it really going to turn over and help the forest as much as we are? How do we measure that impact? How do we make sure that we have flocks that are even big enough? We're talking decades to be able to get this stuff to actually happen. This is where our texts, I think, really help us here. And this is where I think they tie together. We have to recognize, yes, there is an aspect of where we long to have things the way that things used to be. There is a desire within us that because we know that is familiar. We know that. And we want to be able to glorify God and recognizing that we've made mistakes and we can undo it. We can fix it. But the aspect that we forget, and I think this is where I believe it's an underlying theme that isn't necessarily said, but it's important with All Saints Day, is the wisdom has been lost. One of the things that makes Ruth's story with Naomi so intriguing to us is Ruth then wants to learn from Naomi. Ruth clings to her, wants to also help her, but what is the reason for her to cling to her? To learn from her. We hear about in Deuteronomy here, if we follow the Lord, that we will continue to be blessed and we will be able to get to this land flowing with milk and honey. The abundance that God is trying to provide if we cling to the Lord. We have this Hebrews text that is telling us that yes, you're going to screw up on this, but as long as you keep your eyes focused toward the Lord, you will be seen as blameless. So yes, are we recognizing that we have fallen short? Yes. Do we need to recognize then from the Mark text that we need to love God and love neighbor, even if that means hurting myself to love my neighbor? Yes. That's what that is showing. Yes, we need to care about our relationship with God and our relationship with others to recognize the body of Christ. Yes. But that also means that we're going to need wisdom in doing that. And that means that we're going to need all our neighbors, as many of them as we can. That doesn't mean necessarily that we can innovate our way out of it. Doesn't mean that innovation isn't going to be a part of it. But to think that we can innovate out of it, I think could be some flawed logic. Because the problem is if we think that we can innovate our way out of it, we have lost sight of keeping our eyes fixated on God. Because suddenly then we have become God. Now, do I believe that there might be a time and a place and a way that maybe we can do some key reintroductions of keystone species to help with some of these different attributes, like with the forest or bringing back Tasmanian tigers or maybe bringing back woolly mammoths? Sure, but where is the line? We need to spend that time to understand where that is before we do these things. Because otherwise we lose sight of where we're actually trying to go. And then it becomes easy for us to become God ourselves. And if we're supposed to love God and love neighbor, there is no place for me to become God in that. It's one of the things where I struggle a little bit when I hear about these colonizing Mars missions, is that we then lose sight of like what we have with the Revelations text from All Saints, that God is trying to restore this place, recognizing that we messed this up, but it's still God is here and is going to work with us. As long as we continue to work with God and continue to be in relationship with God. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't necessarily go and explore these places, but I think it's too easy for us to suddenly think because we can do this, we don't need to care about this place. And then we have lost sight of the neighbors on who God has created us to be, because then we're seeing neighbors as only human beings. And I would argue that is not our calling. Because then we're suddenly putting a line in the sand and we're making a judgment on who God is putting in and putting out. And again, this gets back to other aspects where we are called not to be the judge. That also means that we cannot call and make the calling on who is our neighbor. It's so easy for us to try to draw lines. It's so easy for us to say, it's done, it's over. There's no way that we can get our way out of this. And yet, we have a God that makes a living out of doing it. We can see that in the John text, talking about the rising up of Lazarus. He is dead. He's got a stench. He is gone, but yet not gone for God. The glory of God is different than what we understand things to be. The things that seem possible to us and are possible for God are different. And we need to be able to get our heads around that and understand that and be able to pursue that and move forward with that. This is where I do believe the ethics on where we are going with some of this genetic technology. I'm not necessarily saying I'm against it, but I am saying that we need to do a lot of thought and we need to make sure that we are pursuing this in the right intentions and we're making sure that we are thinking things through as much as we humanly possibly can, because we need to learn from the wisdom of introducing species into other areas and having unintended consequences. And I don't want to necessarily do this again with hybrids. One of the links that I'll have down below, the scientist Bess Scarpio, the evolutionary biologist from the University of California, Santa Cruz, brings up is you're not technically destinctifying creatures. You're destinctifying traits. We're bringing traits back. We're not bringing the actual animal back. We can think that, but that's not exactly what we're doing. We have to trust in God. We need to make sure that God is part of this conversation, that we are in communications with God and having God help guide us in these times with this. Because the wisdom of God is like what we talked about last week, is generations versus trying to fix these short-term problems. And maybe we don't have the wisdom to see beyond it. We don't have the wisdom to see if we bring back passenger pigeons, it's going to affect this in a way that we aren't anticipating. If we bring back woolly mammoths, it's going to affect this in a way we didn't anticipate. We bring back Tasmanian tigers, it's going to affect the environment in this way, and people aren't expecting this. It gets back to this balance. We need these different traits, we need these different attributes, and we don't necessarily know. Maybe the environment has spawned us ways that it's already taken care of some of this in ways that we aren't expecting or seeing. And that's where it gets back to the wisdom of our environment, the wisdom of things around us, and not taking things for granted. It's frustrating. It's hard. So the question I have for you this week is, what wisdom do you think other people overlook? What wisdom do you think other people overlook? I'd love to hear it, because I think there is wisdom around us in the environment. I think there's wisdom around us with people. I think there's some wisdom that we're overlooking at times for whatever reason, for short-term things, for things that we see as big problems, that we're overlooking bigger problems. And I think there's times where we don't proceed with caution as much as we should proceed with caution. And that's where, is it intriguing for me to see a passenger pigeon hybrid in my lifetime? Yeah, sure. As a birder, that would be awesome. Seeing Tasmanian tigers and woolly mammoths, that would be intriguing, yes. But there's also the aspect of what are the unforeseen consequences of that I'm not contemplating, that I'm not considering, that things that are going to affect things in ways that I don't anticipate. I don't know if you've ever played that game with yourself, that if I made this different decision about my life, how would my life be different? And I know for me, maybe it's because I'm still early on in life, I think about those decisions. Did I choose the right college? And if I had chosen a different college, how my life would be different? If I'd done this differently, would I still led to the same path that I got to? There's so many what ifs in life. And I think there's times where we get caught up in those what ifs and we don't necessarily keep our eyes fixated on moving forward. And keeping our eyes fixated on where God is in, okay, yes, you made that mistake, but I am washing you white as snow. I am restoring this place, but you still need to continue to keep your eyes fixated on me and we're going to fix this together. Now, is this a solution to that? I'm not sure. But I think it's making sure that we are using the wisdom around us and making sure that we are taking in as many variables as we possibly can and making the best decision that we possibly can. And it's hard. In a world that sometimes we want to move fast, sometimes that slows us down, and that's difficult, but it's essential. And as we reflect on the saints that have gone on before us, I pray that we use then the wisdom that they taught us. We reflect and connect with God to be able to tap into the wisdom that God has to direct us, to help us see And in that, connect us to be able to see our neighbors as equals to us. As we continue to connect with God and recognize that God is this one that transcends what is understood as possible to impossible, and continues to restore this place to the way that God intends it to be. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.